I should be live now is what they tell me. Hey, if I'm not live, I'm talking to myself and about 3 other people. But if I am live, thank you so much for tuning in. And no, I am not Kristen. I'm sorry. I don't have that great of a voice. Although, right now, she's not feeling good, so her voice is probably worse than mine. So we're making her rest. Anyhow, just glad you're here. We're going to go over Genesis chapter 25. And the title of the message tonight is Don't Let Bitterness Get the Best of You. And we're going to deal with bitterness and what it does and how in Genesis chapter 25, we're going to see two brothers. There was some serious bitterness going on. And I don't know that it could have been prevented, but I can tell you this. It was definitely instigated. There was some parents, these two women, Hagar and Sarah, that were kind of at each other. And it bred this bitterness with these brothers. And so we're going to talk about that story. And so, Lord, thank you so much for this night. I just ask you to bless those who are just not feeling well. So many people sick. We just ask you to be with them, give them strength, and we love you. Thank you for that. In Jesus' name, amen. And a lot of people are asking, why are you doing online? We have a bunch of sickness within our leadership volunteers, so we're just being safe. And then there's some positives and there's some negatives. We all know that sickness happens, and so we're dealing with the best we can, so that's why we're doing this. So, all right, Genesis chapter 25, there's two topics we're going to talk about today. First one is old but still faithful. We're going to talk about Abraham and how he was, again, 100 years old when he fathered his first child, and somehow God touched his body and gave him vitality again. We're going to find out after Sarah dies, he actually gets remarried and has 6 more children. So he is going to live a very productive life, reproductive life, I should say, after he's 100 years old, after he has a kid. God does something to him, and he continues to procreate, which is kind of a cool thing, unless you're married to somebody like that and you're old and you don't want children. Pause for laughter. Okay, got a couple grins from people in here. All right. Make your life count, dealing with bitterness. I heard John Maxwell one time, he said, why retire when you can re-enlist? And so that's what we're going to, again, kind of talk about Abraham. And this is what he says. Abraham took another wife, and he didn't forcefully take her. He married another woman, and her name was Keturah. And she bore him Zimran, Jokshan, Medan, Midian, Ishbak, and Shua. Jokshan was the father of Sheba and Dedan. The descendants of Dedan were the Asherites, the Letushites, the Lemuites. The sons of Midian were Ephah. This is all life-changing, just so you know. Ephah, Hanok, Abida, Elda, all these were the descendants of Keturah. And you may ask yourself, why do we do lineage? Why is there lineages in the Bible? Because it is not life-changing. You will not be challenged spiritually by going through a lineage. But what it does prove is the validity of the Bible. It's so accurate, and it even gives the names of these different clans, these different people, just to show you that it's accurate. So Abraham now is about 135 to 140 years old. Sarah's been dead for about 20 years. And somewhere in the time after Sarah passes away, he remarries this woman named Keturah. Her name is Incense, which can only insinuate that maybe she smelled good. Or maybe she was a pleasing aroma to people around her. We don't know a whole lot about her other than in 1 Chronicles 1:32, she's actually referred to as a concubine. So she may have been around and once Sarah passed away, and she possibly could have been a concubine of Abraham before then. Now, you might ask what a concubine is. Well, ladies, I hate to tell you this other than you're in free America. A concubine was a woman who was used simply for pleasure and childbearing. That's it. They had really no marriage rights. They were basically considered property. It was a cultural thing. It's a bad thing. It's not something that you would want to be. But in this culture, that's what it was. Just pleasure and a child producer without the rights of marriage. And so in verse 5 through 6, it's a little bit confusing because it says this. It says, Abraham left everything he owned to Isaac. But while he was still living, he gave gifts to the sons of his concubines and sent them away from his son Isaac to the land of the east. And what we don't know is if this is referring to Keturah and Hagar, which were actually wives, and then that begs the question, well, why were they called concubines? So we don't know if maybe Abraham had other concubines that he used to procreate to build his tribe that didn't have any source of wifehood or any rights like that. Again, this was a cultural thing. But what he did was kind of interesting. It's a little bit confusing to me. This culture owned females, okay? So ladies, completely wrong, just so you know where we stand on that. There's questions I don't have the answer to because it's actually kind of polygamy. It's like more than one wife. But here's what I do know. Okay, there's a lot of things I don't know about this. What I do know is that God made marriage between one man and one woman. That was his intention originally in the book of Genesis. We see that. There is nowhere in the Bible you'll find a verse that says, men, take another wife. All right, being married to one, as we all know, can be enough challenge when you just have two people in a relationship. But when you add a third and fourth, it can make it very, very, very difficult. But his original design of both the Old Testament and New Testament is we are to be the husband of one wife. All right. Again, there's no verses supporting or God encouraging polygamy. It seems that he did allow it. Like there was a lot of kings. We look at King David. We look at Abraham, who actually had more than one. But what you also will look at is it always created friction. I don't know of any story in the Bible where there was more than one wife that they didn't have some sort of friction with each other. All right. So we know, again, when you're divorced, if you've gotten a divorce, that blended families typically aren't very easy to manage. And so the problems that I see it creates, especially in our inner cities, are fatherless kids. And this is a huge problem these days when you have these families that they don't have a father there to show them or guide them the way. Kids with no dads to guide them end up in gangs. They end up doing a lot of bad things. All right, verse 6, okay, again, this is kind of an interesting thing. It says he gives them gifts, but then he sends them away. And that really, I think, is a root of a problem because gifts are no replacement for time. Now, if your love language is gifts and time is like the lowest of you might argue with me on this one, but we know when it comes to raising kids, you can give them all the gifts in the world, but if you spend no time with them, the gifts really mean nothing. So why a church family is so important for single parents is because you have that support system around them. If you don't have a father or a mother, the church family can be there. That's why it's important. So it's an environment of influence. Again, it can't replace a parent, but it's something. Now, they were sent away eastward, and today they sit atop the world's biggest oil reserves, which is Saudi Arabia. So he gives them gifts, and again, he sends them away. But again, it takes hundreds, if not thousands of years for the sons that were sent away to actually get something out of where they were sent, and that is oil. All right, we'll see in verse 18 as we go on that these offspring will live in hostility toward Isaac's family line. And again, it's because of a favoritism that was shown here between Isaac. When he was born, he was a child of the promise. Ishmael, again, was born out of hurriedness. If you haven't been a part of the study at all, what had happened was God had promised Abraham and Sarah a child of the promise. And they waited about 10 years and nothing happened. And so Sarah took her maidservant Hagar, an Egyptian woman, gave her to Abraham as his wife and wanted to have a family through her. Well, he slept with her, got her pregnant, and they produced a child named Ishmael, but that wasn't God's plan. And Ishmael was kind of a crazy kid. He would be very aggressive eventually toward his brothers, but it was not God's plan. And anytime you rush God's plan, it typically makes a mess. God can work with it, okay, but it's always better to be patient when God gives you a promise and not try to do it on your own. Many of you probably know the story of a little boy, and maybe you've never heard it before, that caught a caterpillar, and he wanted to see it turn into a butterfly. And so after a few days in his jar with a stick in it, it turned into a cocoon. And so he watched it, and then one day the cocoon started moving, and it seemed to be struggling to get out. And the butterfly was inside, but it was having a hard time getting out. So he got a couple toothpicks, and he opened up the cocoon for the butterfly. Well, the butterfly fell to the bottom of the jar, and it never did fly. What the little boy didn't realize is what he thought he was doing was helping. He was actually hindering, because the way God designed a cocoon is to take strength or build strength for the butterfly to actually have strength for its wings to open it up. And so he bypassed that part. So what he thought was a help was actually a hindrance, and that's really what Abraham and Sarah did. They created a problem that we're still seeing in the world today. All right, and this is going to turn into bitterness, which is kind of the heart of our message. So here's what I believe happened, at least with Ishmael. I believe that bitterness developed from a bad decision by his parents, again, to go around God's original plan. Ishmael was not part of God's original plan. Again, God worked with it, but it created some serious issues. And again, this is what happens when we don't listen to God's will, or we rush things or do things our way. All right, and this hostility still exists today. It's Arabs and it's Israel. They're still fighting, and they will fight to the very end. And I will tell you this with bitterness. Bitterness is passed down from fathers to sons, okay? It's passed down from mothers to daughters. Bitterness is passed down. And as parents, we pass something on to our kids. Now, I have a little illustration here. We have a jar of clean water, and all it takes really is one drop, okay, to permeate this whole glass. And by the time we're done here, that will be pretty much black. It doesn't take a lot of bitterness or a little seed of bitterness to destroy something, to ruin something that started out pure. And as we can see it, if you can see it on the film, it's a slow thing. Okay, it doesn't happen fast. Bitterness typically takes a little bit of time. It kind of ruminates, but eventually affects everything. You think about coffee. Most people, if they drink a cup of black coffee for the first time, they will tell you it's bitter. And I was thinking today that bitterness can be an acquired taste. Okay, people that eventually drink black coffee, they don't see it as bitter anymore, but you give it to somebody who's never had black coffee and they will tell you it's bitter. Okay, so who's right? Okay, well, the fact is it is still bitter to the person who's never had it before. The person who drinks black coffee, it's not bitter just because they've acquired the taste to it. And I don't want in my life ever to acquire the taste of bitterness. I don't ever want to be bitter really and not know it. I don't want to be bitter about something and have it permeate my entire life. Why? Because when I get bitter, it infects other people. Okay, bitterness really is like a virus that seems to get spread pretty quickly, and it can affect many people around you. So we have to deal with that bitterness, all right? It seems that bitterness is spread easier or faster than joy. I wish that wasn't the case, but it's really true. So you may be on the side that Ishmael was on. I want you to think about your personal life right now. One thing that Ishmael did not do is he didn't create his own problems to be born, right? He was born out of some bad decisions. He didn't create this. He didn't ask for it, but he had to deal with it. And so my question for you right now is what are you dealing with that you didn't ask for? What are some things that you're having to go through? Maybe somebody else made some decisions that affected you directly. And how do you deal with that? Because what we're going to see here is Ishmael actually didn't deal with it correctly. And it infected his whole life. It infected his family as it passed down from generation. We'll see in verse 18 that he shared this bitterness. He had this bitterness that went to his kids. And it was one of those things that never got stopped. And because of that, we have what we have even today, where Arabs and Israel, they just don't like each other. It comes from this story, right? He deals with it, but he deals with it poorly, okay? What are you doing with that? What are you doing with that in your life? Maybe some bitterness has gotten planted in your heart. Are you letting it permeate, or are you dealing with it? So here's what happens in verse chapter 8. It says, altogether, verse 7, altogether Abraham lived 175 years. Okay, then Abraham breathed his last, and he died at a good old age, an old man and full of years, and he was gathered to his people. His sons Isaac and Ishmael, okay, important verse here, buried him in the cave of Machpelah near Mamre in the field of Ephron, son of Zohar the Hittite. The field Abraham had bought from the Hittites, there Abraham was buried with his wife Sarah. After Abraham's death, God blessed his son Isaac, who then lived near Beer Lahai Roi. And so what we see here is a little family reunion. We have no inclination that Isaac and Ishmael had seen each other. If you haven't been with us, don't know the story. When Isaac was born, he was about 3 years old. They threw him a party because he was potty trained at that point. Ishmael was around 17 years old. He was 14 when Isaac was about 17 years old. And all of a sudden, Isaac was a child of the promise. Here, Ishmael, again, was the only child of Abraham that we know of, was probably treated as an only child, but had a good relationship. And all of a sudden, he's replaced by this little baby. He was probably kind of pushed out. We know that Sarah, Isaac's mom, treated Hagar and Ishmael very poorly. Probably talked very bad about it, probably made them do the nasty jobs. So Ishmael had a lot to get over. Again, he didn't ask for it, but he had to deal with it. And he made fun of Isaac, and that is when they basically got kicked out of the house at that point. So they have this reunion here when Dad dies. Okay, they hadn't seen each other, and I kind of wonder, what was this little meeting like? There had to be some tension there. Had to be tension between these two brothers, but somehow they got together and they were able to at least be cordial with each other, as far as we know, to bury their father. But I'm wondering, okay, what was Ishmael thinking at this point? Okay, what was he thinking at this point? Again, the only child and rejected. Only child for 14 years and then rejected. And you may feel that. You may feel that maybe your parents or somebody rejected you and you had nothing to do with it, but you're on the receiving end of it. What do you do with it? Do you allow it to get into your life like that? Or do you deal with it in a way to say, you know what, I'm not going to let it get in me, because it can get on you, but it doesn't necessarily have to get in you. But he felt rejected. It was neither of their faults. It wasn't Isaac's fault. Isaac wasn't the one that was doting on himself. Okay, he was a child of the promise. It wasn't his fault either. But what was the tension here as they're meeting together, burying their dad? What was said? Bible just doesn't say. You know, I hope that when we get to heaven, we'll be able to ask those questions. All right. Neither of their faults, but they had to deal with the consequences of their parents. Okay, and you may be facing that situation today. The question is, how are you dealing with it? Again, neither of these guys can be blamed for the situation, but they are responsible for how they react to it. Now, interesting enough, Isaac is never shown as being hostile toward his brother Ishmael. There's never, we don't see any bitterness. We don't see anything with Isaac that would lead us to believe that he had this attitude toward his older brother or really anybody at all. He just seemed to be just a good guy, but Ishmael had issues. Ishmael had some problems that he actually passed down to those that he bore. All right, but this the death of Abraham put the inheritance in play. This is a modern day problem when we see parents die. People go after the stuff. I've seen, again, as a pastor, I've seen a lot of things happen when parents die that the siblings will fight over things, and a lot of times things that aren't even worth that much. But it's like, who can get the stuff? So practically, have a will. Okay, have a will set up to prevent that type of thing. And I would also say, clean out your sheds so your kids don't have to deal with it, right? I've also seen that too. So get rid of most of the stuff that you have. That way your kids don't have to deal with it. Unless you just don't like your kids, and leave them all kinds of garbage that they have to deal with. All right. Say wills are important. It's kind of an interesting thing. All right. This now the 12 through 18 is Ishmael's family tree. Again, it's just a lineage thing. Kind of interesting, but we got to read it. It says, this is the account of Abraham's son Ishmael, whom Sarah's maidservant Hagar the Egyptian bore to Abraham. This is Ishmael's last mention in the Bible, at least as far as his name is mentioned in the New Testament, but really nothing about him. But this is his last mention. Okay, and it's a sad last mention when we get to the very end of the verse because he leaves a legacy that really isn't something to be proud of. This is the account of Abraham's son Ishmael, whom Sarah's maidservant Hagar, the Egyptian, bore to Abraham. These are the names of the sons of Ishmael, listed in order of their birth. Nebaioth, the firstborn of Ishmael, Kedar, Abdil, Mibsam, Misha, Dumah. I was going to joke if there was people here, Dumb and Dumma, but this is Dumma. All right. Massa, Hadad, Tema, Jetur, Nephish, and Kedema. Now, he probably had daughters as well. Typically, they just list the sons, which I know that's incorrect, but that's the way they did it back then. These were the sons of Ishmael, and these are the names of the 12 tribal rulers according to their settlements and camps. Now again, Abraham was promised that he would be the father of many nations, and Hagar was promised that her son would also be the father of many nations. So we see biblical prophecy coming about right here. Altogether, Ishmael lived 137 years. He breathed his last, and he died, and he was gathered to his people. And I kind of wonder, who were his people? Like if he was not a God-fearing person, you know, when we say Abraham was gathered to his people, was it people that were believers in God before, and you know, where did Ishmael go? I don't know. I don't want to speculate, but it doesn't really say he was serving God, whatever. So wherever his people are. So the point is when you die, you will go to the people that were like you. There's a heaven or there's a hell. You're either going to go spend eternity with Christians, or you're going to spend eternity with those who rejected Christ, depending on whether you accepted or rejected Christ. Either way, we're going to breathe our last, and we're going to spend eternity somewhere. All right, 137 years, okay? And it says, the descendants settled in the area from Havilah to Shur, near the border of Egypt, as you go on toward Asher. Now, interesting thing here, the King James Version actually does not have the next part of this verse out. New King James does have it. NIV has it, and a lot of other versions have it, but I thought that was kind of interesting. I didn't really discover why, but I just looked in the King James, and it actually doesn't have the last part of this verse, but it is in original manuscripts, so it's there. And it's a key verse. It's very important. It says this. Okay, he just talked about his whole line, Ishmael's whole family. The last verse there says, and they lived in hostility toward all their brothers. Okay, and the reason it is so important is we see a legacy that Ishmael left. We see that he passed down to his kids a hostility. Okay, a bitterness, something that permeated him, got into his spirit, and he spread that to his kids. He spread it to his grandkids, okay, and that continues to spread today. Again, with Arabs in Israel, Arabs do not like Israelis, okay, and so we still see this bitterness, a couple thousand years ago, is still spread down, and it's so important that we understand the words that we speak, the attitudes that we have, and how they can infect those around us, okay? How they can permeate somebody's life. We can ruin a completely clean life by just pouring bitterness into that, or how they were wronged, or how you were wronged, or how these things happened, they shouldn't have happened. Be careful what you say, because it gets passed down. Yeah, here's the good news. It can be broken, okay? It can be broken when Jesus is involved, but very telling of what was passed down from generation to generation, okay? So don't let bitterness get the best of you. That's the title of tonight's message. Don't let bitterness get the best of you. Every single one of us will experience bitterness, okay? I promise you. There's something that we'll be bitter about pretty much every day. There's something that we can get a little seed of bitterness in there. The important thing is we don't allow it to grow. We don't allow it to overtake our life. Because a bitter life is no way to live, okay? Ishmael, what happened here? Again, he carried this rejection, and he passed it down, and again, we're still seeing it in the world today. So I'm not telling you that, you're not going to feel rejected, you're not going to get some sort of seed of bitterness. What I'm asking you to do is don't let it infect you. Don't let it get into your life so that you pass it on to other people. Here's what I personally believe. I don't believe that you'll ever achieve God's plan for your life if you live in bitterness. Okay, think of what Jesus had to choose and how he was treated. If there's anybody in history that had a right to be bitter, it was Jesus. Okay, I heard a pastor say this the other day. I was listening to a podcast, and I thought this was great. And this guy's mom actually said it to him when he was going through something hard. And she said, "Son, you're either going to live Teflon or Velcro." He's like, "What do you mean? Teflon or Velcro? What does Teflon do? Teflon things slide off of Teflon. Okay, Velcro things stick to." And she was teaching him this lesson that life is going to throw things at you. And will you have a Teflon life, or will you have a Velcro life? Will you let things slide off you, or will you hold on to things? And I thought it was a very, very good illustration that this mom was teaching her pastor's son. And I don't know if she told him when he was a pastor or when he was younger, but he was just sharing that. See, bitterness and peace cannot live in the same house. Okay, it's like oil and water. They just don't mix. I know personally bitter people who don't realize that they're bitter. Okay, they don't even see it in themselves, right? So it's a very vulnerable question that you can ask somebody, is if you don't know if you have any bitterness in your life or not, ask somebody who knows you well. Ask somebody who knows a lot about you, and just ask that question, do you see any bitterness in me? And if they do, then you can deal with it, all right? If you don't know the answer yourself, do it. So I want to close with this. I watched an interview with Elizabeth Smart last week, and if you don't know who Elizabeth Smart was, she was 14 years old, lived in Utah, and she was abducted at night by knife point. And the evil guy that did it, and you can look at it online, he held a knife to her, and he said, "If you scream, I will kill your family." And so at 14 years old, she was taken out of her house, and it was abducted for almost a year, and she got raped daily. And so she gets interviewed. She is now a speaker. She goes and speaks at conferences and stuff. But you talk about a young woman who did not allow what happened to her to define her. And if you've gone through something really hard, YouTube her, Elizabeth, because she has such an encouraging message, and she talks pretty candidly about what happened to her. Again, the rape every day by this guy and his evil wife. And just how the whole story where she prayed a lot. But she suffered some effects, but she didn't allow her captor to keep her hostage after she was set free. If you want a true story of freedom and forgiveness, look at Elizabeth Smart. She wrote a book, but she has some really good interviews. And her view is this: it happened to me, but that isn't who I am. And now she lives a successful life, has a family. It's really, really a cool story. And we can learn something from this. Okay, the statement here is, don't play the victim. Don't play the victim. The victim mentality is also passed on, and I think that's what happened to Ishmael, right? So be careful when agreeing with somebody about how they were treated. If you agree a lot with somebody, if they were treated poorly and you just feed that into it, you can continue to help them play the victim. Now, obviously, there's circumstances when you can have that compassion. I'm not saying don't be incompassionate, but there are times that we can play into somebody's victim mentality or victim feeling by just feeding it, okay? Yeah, you're right. Shouldn't have happened. Again, know when to and when not to. It depends on the circumstance here. So, all right, so here's your homework. Okay, your homework is this. Don't allow bitterness to take root in your life, all right? If you have it, deal with it, okay? Forgive or seek forgiveness, okay? Being hurt and listen to me, being hurt and being bitter can be two different things, okay? You can be hurt without being bitter. You can be hurt without it infecting your whole life, okay? Seeds constantly are landing in the garden of your heart and in your mind. And you can't always determine the seeds that land in your soil, but you can determine what you allow to grow there. So, all right, that's the study for tonight. I am excited about next week. Next week, we're going to talk about Jacob and Esau, and it is a powerful, powerful story. Little bit of a heads up here. There's twins, okay, in the womb, and they're fighting. Okay, they're just going at it, and the mom, who is Rebecca, is Isaac's wife. And they waited 20 years to have kids. I mean, and finally they prayed about it, like, okay, God. And so God says, all right, you want kids? I'm going to give you two at the same time. And it's a crazy story because these babies are fighting, not just normally. Babies obviously move around, but something was happening inside of her that she knew was abnormal. I mean, they're like going at it. And she goes and prays about it. And she's like, God, what is going on? And God basically says, there's two nations in your womb, and they're fighting. I mean, they're going at it. So even from the womb, these babies are going at it, and they would later fight with each other. And then we see how Esau, he's a mighty hunter. We have Jacob, who kind of lives among the tents and he takes care of stuff. And we're going to see this conflict between two brothers. And what happens, we're going to just see deception, and we're going to see Esau give up his entire inheritance for a bowl of soup. Okay, it's a great parallel of how the devil can trick us into giving up something super special for something that we just want at the moment. So hope you'll be here next week. We will have live church next Wednesday night. I almost guarantee you that. Almost, is that even a thing? Can you say almost guarantee? I don't think so, all right. So anyways, thank you so much again for coming in or tuning in. I hope you have a wonderful week. Again, make a difference in somebody's life, and we'll see you soon. Thanks. Probably still live.